Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Monday here at the Northeast Georgia History Center. We're so glad you're with us. We wanted to take today's program to talk a little bit about the Vietnam War. Now, we only have about an hour, so I want to first say that there is no way we're going to be able to cover this incredibly complex time and this incredibly complex struggle in its entirety in this hour. I just want to give you a brief overview, give you a little bit of information on what caused the war, the progression and the outcome of the war, and some of the experiences and the equipment of the individual soldier. That's what I have behind me here. So, the Vietnam War, of course, this takes place, depending on how you begin the count of the beginning, as early as 1954. But really, Vietnam, or French Indochina, was its own country after World War II. As part of the settlement of World War II, Japan had invaded what is today Vietnam and had sent soldiers in there to occupy the territory. When they were defeated in World War II, the French, the allies of the Americans and the British and the Soviets, were given this part of the country as a colony. So this was a French colony here, and that's why it got the name French Indochina. And they stayed there until about 1954. The problem with French rule is that, of course, the people of Vietnam wanted to be independent. They desperately wanted to be independent, just as most colonies did after the end of World War II. There was a force in Vietnam called the Viet Minh, which was sort of a guerrilla force that fought against French forces, and they were able to begin surrounding the French armies and eventually caused them one by one to surrender until the last French army at Dien Bien Phu, a town in the northern part of Vietnam. The army was surrounded, it could not be resupplied, and as a result they surrendered. Now what happens is, after the French pull out or leave French Indochina, it is agreed to divide the country in two. The northern part will become a socialist communist government, and the southern part will become a democratic government. These are at least the ideas that were put forward. So what you end up with in the 1950s is a North and a South Vietnam, two separate countries, two theoretically independent countries, but of course they want to be one, and the forces in the North and in the South have different ideas of what the government should be once that country becomes a unified part. So both sides are going to fight not only to unify the country, but to set up their own decision of government within that single united country. The North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese, of course, begin a war to try to settle this. And the communist forces in the North receive a lot of support from the Soviet Union and from China. And in the South, the United States, as the main democratic country, tries to offer help to the South Vietnamese in the struggle. And this eventually starts to build and build and build. What happens is, at first, in the late 50s and early 60s, the United States sends advisors. They do not send soldiers to fight at first. They're sending specialists to teach the South Vietnamese how to fight. And yeah, let me back up too and also put this in a larger global perspective. After the end of World War II, we enter what is called the Cold War. The Cold War is a time when the forces of the communists, especially the Soviet Union, find themselves against and in conflict with the Western forces, the United States, England, and France. There were former allies in World War II, but they have an ideological and a political and a military split. So all around the world, these two main forces are trying to set up different ways that they can take advantage of the other. And one of the places they do this is in the former French Indochina, now North and South Vietnam. And the United States has this theory. It's called the domino theory. I'm sure many of you have played dominoes at home. You line the dominoes up, and then you hit one, and they go tuk, 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 and they all fall down. The United States was afraid that if one country, if one domino is one country, that if one country became communist, then it would fall into the next country, and so on, and eventually all these small countries would become communist. The United States desperately wanted to prevent this, so they began sending aid to anywhere that they thought it might be a danger that this country was going to turn communist. So they began to send more and more aid to South Vietnam. Instead of just advisors, they began to send aircraft. They began to send artillery. They began to send pilots and soldiers to operate these aircraft and this artillery. They begin to send United States military supplies to the South Vietnamese. And what they eventually see happening is that the South Vietnamese may not be able to defeat the North Vietnamese. And so as a result, the United States begins to send combat troops. It begins to send not soldiers that are just supporting South Vietnamese soldiers. They begin to send United States soldiers whose job is to fight the North Vietnamese. Now, the North Vietnamese have two types of soldiers that are operating. They have the North Vietnamese Army. These are the actual soldiers. They all have the same uniform. They all fight the same, and they are part of North Vietnam. There are also soldiers in South Vietnam that we call guerrillas. They're not uniformed soldiers. They're sort of secret soldiers that don't go out and fight in standard types of combat. They sort of hide out. They hide amongst the civilian population. These are the Viet Cong. So the Viet Cong are guerrillas in the South, and they're very hard to find. They're very hard to defeat because they'll just go, they'll make a quick attack, and then they'll melt away back into the civilian population or back into the jungles or the hills or the tunnels or wherever they may be hiding. So the South Vietnamese and eventually the American forces are having to fight these two types of battles. If we can go over to our map for just a second, I want to sort of show you how this works out from a geographic perspective. So Vietnam sort of stretches along the coast here. South Vietnam is here. This is the yellow part, right? And up here in the north, this part's the land isn't really yellow and pink. We just had to pick those colors. This is North Vietnam, and you can see right here is where they're divided up. There's another country down here called Cambodia. There's another country up here called Laos. Now, all of these were at one time French Indochina, but they were able to split this up. So the American forces begin to fortify the south to attack the north. The northern capital is here in Hanoi. All the way down here, the southern capital is Saigon. And the main American base where the supplies, the soldiers will come in via sea transport is right here at Cam Ranh Bay. We also have some large airfields right around there at Nha Trang. There's one here at Ben Hoa. There's one here at Chu Lai, and there's another one here at Da Nang. Now, the United States, as I said, is trying to fight the Vietnamese forces that are coming south as well as the Viet Cong forces, and there's something called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and I'll get to Ho Chi Minh in just a second. This trail goes through a different country. It goes through Laos from right here at the line from North Vietnam, and it comes through here, and part of it can go into attack here, and part of this can go here. This is how the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army are coming into the south to get supplies and fight and things like that. So what happens is the United States begins to develop bases. Now, remember when the French were here in Indochina, their bases got surrounded and they could not be resupplied. But the United States has some tactical advantages and they have some technological advantages that allow these bases to be supplied. And primarily, that is with helicopters. Helicopters are a relatively new military application. We had helicopters about a decade before in Korea, but they were small and they were mostly used to either observe the enemy or to carry wounded. And only one or two wounded soldiers at a time could be carried on these helicopters. That was it. By the time we get to the 1960s, the United States has a large fleet of very fast, very capable helicopters. The most popular one is called a Huey. And these Hueys can take a lot of different soldiers in, and we have a lot of them so that we can send supplies into these bases. So the bases may be surrounded on the ground, but they're not surrounded in the air, and those helicopters are able to bring in new soldiers, they're able to bring in new supplies, and take out the wounded soldiers. So the idea of helicopter combat is something that predominates our image of what the Vietnam War was for Americans. Now, there are also some places up and down here that are some famous battles. I'm not going to get into all those famous battles today, but here's Khe Sanh. This is what we were afraid would happen. There were a set of Marines stationed here, and they were also surrounded, and people were like, oh no, it's going to be the same as Dien Bien Phu a decade before, well, we were able to resupply and we kept putting in soldiers so that eventually the North Vietnamese army had to stop attacking there. Sort of the same thing happened down in here, down in the south, these different things, and they were able to do it. Now, what happens though is that the United States, to maintain this, gets more and more involved. They have to put in more soldiers, which means they have to spend more money. And because they need soldiers, the United States has something in place called the draft. We don't have this today, but the draft is where, and this has existed in American history for a long time, all the way back to the Civil War. They put different people's names in a big bucket and they draw those names out. And if your name is drawn, you automatically have to go into the Army. That's the draft. And this was something that became very unpopular because this was not a very popular war at home. Because again, people felt the need to spend their money on problems that were happening at home. There was lots of poverty. There were lots of things going on in the United States that people wanted to focus on, and many people felt, that the war in Vietnam was taking away from the things that really needed to happen. So it's a complex issue of larger politics, international politics, and domestic policies at home. This makes it somewhat unpopular. Now, the entire country was not against the Vietnam War. There were many people who thought that the United States should support all of its allies everywhere, just as we had always done. So one of the biggest issues with opposition to the war was among young people, because of course the young people, when they turned 18 or 19, are the ones who are going to be drafted into the military. People don't want to be picked up from their life and put into a war, especially if they don't believe in it a lot of times. So this becomes an issue. And the war in Vietnam, as I say, it's not popular at home, and it's very difficult to fight. They're fighting in very difficult terrain sometimes. It could be very dry and very hot in the summer. It could be very wet and rainy. There were parts that were very muggy and almost like a jungle. There was large parts of Vietnam where they would fight that was like a jungle, and we'll get to that a second when we talk about the equipment. But as time goes on, the United States, as I said, has to put more and more and more men and money into the war. And something happens in 1969. The North Vietnamese want to have a big battle to basically force the Americans to leave, and this is called the Tet Offensive. The North Vietnamese sign not a peace treaty, but an agreement that, you know what, Tet is one of their holidays, and we don't want to fight during our holiday, so let's just say that we're going to have peace for a couple of weeks and no one will fight. The North agrees to this, the South agrees to this, and the Americans agree to this. Well, the North Vietnamese are smart strategists, and they think that they'll be able to, if they attack now, they'll be able to have the advantage because everyone is expecting peace. So they have a huge attack, not only from the North Vietnamese army from the north, but all of these guerrilla parts rise up and begin to attack in the cities. And long story short, the American army eventually is able to defeat all of those guerrilla uprisings in the cities. And the Viet Cong have tens of thousands of casualties because of this, and because of the Tet Offensive losses, and because of the Americans going after the Viet Cong the Viet Cong more or less ceases to be a problem in South Vietnam. In effect, militarily, the Americans eventually win the Battle of Tet. But the problem is, and this is something that we take for granted nowadays, but this was the first war where people were able to see on their television footage from the war that had happened that very day. And so when people are seeing this in the news, it makes them very upset, it makes them very concerned, and they see that perhaps with what they're seeing on television, the war is not going to be won, and so they want to get out. So ironically, even though the Tet Offensive turned out to be a military victory for the American military, from a point of view of the will of the people at home to continue the fight, that will from the people at home starts to go away to almost nothing, and it forces our elected officials to eventually seek a way out. Not even necessarily to win, but just to find a way out. So over the next year and a half, people from the Nixon administration begin to talk to people from the North, and they agree eventually that the United States will withdraw its combat troops from Vietnam and go back home to the United States. And the United States would only give some money aid and some military equipment to the South. And eventually what happens is they cut off all aid because it's become too unpopular at home. And eventually the North is able to then attack the South very effectively. And in 1975, the Northern forces get all the way down to Saigon. They take over the southern Vietnamese capital, and they are able to unite the country under a communist government. Now, the leader of the North was a fellow named Ho Chi Minh. He was very much a nationalist. That means he believed in Vietnam as his own country. And he had seen a lot of things. He was even, believe it or not, at the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. So by the time we get to the Vietnam War, he's sort of an old man, but he had been a diplomat and had been someone who supported the cause of Vietnamese independence for a long time. And he had been looking for anyone to help him and his country gain that independence. He asked the United States. The United States was not interested, unfortunately. He even wrote a Declaration of Independence for Vietnam that sounds very, very much like the Declaration of Independence that Thomas Jefferson wrote for us in the United States. But he eventually found support from communist countries such as the Soviet Union and China, and thus he decided to make his government modeled after them. That's why he wanted the support of the communists. That's why Vietnam eventually turned into a communist country. And so the Vietnam War technically ends in 1975. It does unify Vietnam, and for a long time after that, the country doesn't do too well, but then they enact some reforms, and today, economically, Vietnam is doing pretty well, and they've relaxed a lot of the bad things that tend to happen with a communist government in terms of oppressing freedom of speech and things like that. What did the Vietnam War do to the United States? Well, one thing it did is it gave us what we call the Vietnam Syndrome. It made Americans very afraid and very cautious to get into any sort of foreign war at all because we were afraid we would be sucked into something that we wouldn't be able to control or get out of, or would be expensive, or would cost too many lives for not enough of a gain, of an honorable sort of just war. So that happened. We also have the Vietnam War happen at the exact same time as the Nixon administration when they had the Watergate scandal. I won't go into that, maybe that's a topic for another day, but between the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal and a lot of the civil rights unrest that happens in the United States, Americans began to lose faith in their own government. And it's an interesting twist. When you go back to World War I and FDR as president, the United States was not only very unified in the war that it was fighting against Japan and Germany, but Americans very much trusted and believed in their government to do the right thing for the people and on an international scale. By the time you get to a post-Vietnam world in the 1970s, people don't have the faith in their government that they once did. They see it as corrupt. They see it as grasping and being too willing to become involved in overseas things that maybe they shouldn't be involved in. But it has a big effect on the United States and on the military. And as a matter of fact, one of the biggest things that it did to affect the way the military operates is that in 1973, the United States does away with the draft. They say, we're not going to draft soldiers anymore. We're going to go to an army where everyone volunteers. It's an all-volunteer army. Interestingly enough, as soon as they did away with the draft, opposition to the actual conflict in Vietnam more or less went away overnight. Only about 10 to 12% of people were opposed to the war, but then, of course, we were out of the war and a lot of different aspects were going on internationally and within the United States. So in a nutshell, that's the course of the Vietnam War and some of the legacy. But what was it like to fight the war? What was it like to be one of those soldiers? Well, let's scoot over to this table and some of these items, and we can talk about some of the equipment and the uses of that equipment in the war. Of course, we've got that ubiquitous helmet. This is the same style of helmet that soldiers way back in World War II used. They used this type of helmet through World War II and Korea, and now they're using it in Vietnam, although now it has a cloth camouflage pattern cover on it. It still has the same inside. It has a little framework that sits on your head so it can sit on your head like this. And it doesn't stop bullets, but it can help with some exploding shrapnel and things like that, okay? So this weighs, about 7 or 8 pounds on a scale, but I've talked to guys who were in the Vietnam War and they said it sure got heavier the longer they had to wear it. So this was something that you're always going to see on an American soldier. This is the type of uniform that they're going to have. As I said, Vietnam tended to be very hot, very wet, and so this material that the uniform top is made out of is called poplin. It's called poplin ripstop, and I don't know if you can see, it's kind of got a little square pattern in it, in the cloth. Can we? Yeah, there we go. You can see that. So the cotton makes it cooler to wear, and that square pattern means that if it gets ripped or cut walking through all the underbrush and in the jungle, the rip won't keep going. It's rip stop. It'll stop the tear from happening. You also have what the military calls load-bearing equipment. That's basically just the suspenders and the belts and the pouches to carry your stuff, right? So we have the suspenders here that go over your shoulder to help with the weight. We have ammo pouches right here to carry magazines for the rifle here and here. They can each also have a grenade on each side. And they're going to carry as much ammunition for their rifle as possible. So they have these cloth bandoliers that hold a sort of a box magazine like that. And each one of these holds 20 rounds. So again, they're going to carry just as much of the ammunition on their person as they can. But of course, that means things get pretty heavy. Something else that gets heavy when you carry it is water. So everyone's going to carry at least a couple of canteens. They may carry more because these soldiers sometimes are going to be going out on patrol that lasts a whole day. Sometimes it may be 2 or 3 days, so they're going to need to carry all the food, all the ammunition, and all the water that they're going to need. This is also the same pattern as the World War II canteen, but it's made of plastic, so it's a little bit lighter, right? It's a little bit lighter, and they also have to carry water purification pills because they can't just run to a water fountain or a sink somewhere.
Okay. I think we are back.
Are we back now?
I think so. Let's make doubly sure with our chat.
Okay.
Okay, give me a test, Glenn.
1, 2, 3. Can you hear me?
Let's see what the folks say.
Are we back now?
I think so. Let's see, doubly sure with our chat.
Okay.
Sound back, I hear music. All right.
1, 2, 3. Can you hear me?
Okay, yes.
You can hear me? Okay, yay! All right, sorry about that, folks. We appreciate you sticking with us and being patient. It's a brave new world we live in, and I suppose this is the new normal. Let me go back and talk about the boot, because we can't talk about the Vietnam War without talking about footwear. This is incredibly important. So we have a rubber sole with lots of good grips on it. The parts that are going to get really worn and need to be durable are still made of leather, but the top is made of a cotton canvas. Right, so it can breathe better. It can let the water go in and out better. And if water does get in these boots, because they know they're going to be in a wet environment, they have these cool little vents right here. I don't know if you can see those, but that allows water to drain out of the bottom of the boot if they happen to get water in there. So they really think these through. These are actually called jungle boots, right? They're made specifically for that purpose. As I said, it's going to get really wet. So one of the things that soldiers are going to carry a lot of with them is the lowly sock, because dry socks can make all the difference in how well your feet are taken care of. So they're going to carry a lot of cushion sole, OD green, cotton socks. Right? It seems simple, but these things become incredibly, incredibly important. Now, the food I was telling you about, they're going to have something called C rations or combat rations. They're going to come in a box. And you can see this one, meal, combat, individual, because the military loves to do things these ways. And inside this box is supposed to represent one meal. And it's going to have some accessories in it. It's going to have some canned goods. And for example, there's a B2 unit. There's beef slices with potatoes and gravy. There's even white bread. The bread comes in a can. Yeah.
It just says white bread on it.
White bread from the American Bread Company in Nashville. There's even a little tin of peanut butter, and this is actually made in Dawson, Georgia. Yeah, so there's something, and by the way, all this is original. So this is made in Dawson, Georgia, peanut butter tins, and usually what they would do is they wouldn't carry these boxes with them. They would take the boxes apart in camp and sort of just stick the cans in their pockets and their packs, even put them in socks. Right? They could put 3 or 4 cans in a sock and carry them that way. They're also going to have a little accessory packet that comes in there. And here in the accessory packet, they're going to have a little plastic spoon. That's what they eat everything with, right? They're going to have some matches, a book of matches. Here is some instant coffee. Here's some sugar for the instant coffee, a cream substitute for the coffee. And this is important too. This goes to show you how the military is perhaps more prepared than we are. Every meal comes with this little packet of paper. Now, can you guess what this paper may be? This is their tissue paper. This is their toilet paper, right? This is all they get for about a day and a half, or not a day and a half. They would have maybe 2 of these a day. So they certainly knew how to take care and make their toilet paper last. Let's all take a lesson from those brave veterans from the Vietnam War. As I said, it was very wet, so they would often carry a towel with them. They might take the towel, put it around their neck like this to kind of dab the sweat off of them, to keep the other moisture off of them. And if it really started raining, you're going to have this sort of this rubber poncho, right? Here's the hood, it just goes over their head, and then they're going to put it over their arms like that, and that's going to kind of maybe help keep the rain off of them. Now, the weather and the wet was always the biggest issue, and you notice that these ammo pouches, the belt, and the suspenders, these are made of cotton. Cotton's very durable, but when it gets wet, it soaks the water up, it becomes heavy, and it can start to deteriorate and sort of rip because it just gets rotted from so much weather. So they began to develop new pouches and new equipment made out of nylon fabric, right? And this is what they still use today. Instead of cotton, this is nylon fabric. It's the same exact kind of pouch. It has the little grenade holders on the side, has the place inside to put the magazines. But they begin to think about saving weight too. So here, they've got a cool little shovel that they would carry. And this folds in, and it unfolds, and you can dig your latrine, you can dig a foxhole or anything like that, and then when you're done, it just, wait a minute. Folds back up, like that, and it can go in your holder. Now, they also needed to prepare folks for serving, so they had a lot of literature and a lot of books. Here's an important one. Soldiers were issued with these, or could purchase them if they wanted to. They're in Vietnam. They're going to need to know how to speak the language. So this book would have different phrases that they could use. So you see, where is the post office? When does it open? Where can I buy stamps? And they have the words next to it. Thera ong so bien din adao. Where is the post office? And this entire book has all these important phrases. Now, this is kind of neat. I don't know if there's anybody out there who likes comics, but the military realized that getting soldiers to read manuals about how to maintain weapons and take care of jeeps and vehicles and things like that can be pretty boring, so they put some of these into a comic book format. So here's one on operation and maintenance of the M16A1 rifle. And look how exciting this is. It's got great illustrations, right? It tells you how to take care of your weapon. It even has an attractive lady to show you how to take care of your weapon. So lots of different adaptability you see in the military at that time, from how they're training soldiers to how they're developing the equipment to how they're reacting to the tactics of the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong. The United States Army, over this 10-plus year period when it's fighting the Vietnam War, goes through a lot of changes, and it goes through a lot of adaptation based on what's happening at home in the United States, based on what the equipment is, based on what the needs in the field are. It's actually a pretty good fighting force, but here's one of the problems they face. These drafted soldiers, they only have to spend a 1-year tour of duty in Vietnam. So you have this soldier, he joins up. It takes you about 3 to 4 months to train him, right? To train this soldier up. Then he goes to Vietnam, and he has to spend 365 days there. And if he's not wounded, if he's not killed in action, he gets a lot of experience and really gets good at his job. But then his year is up, and he doesn't have to stay. He can go back and spend the rest of his time in the Army somewhere else besides in a war zone. So what happens is you get this influx of soldiers constantly that are having to relearn all of the lessons that the veterans are don't necessarily get to translate to these young ones, and that causes a big problem. So it causes a lot of turnover in the Army that's not super effective. And again, a lot of these draftees, the ones who go into the military, they don't want to be in this war. They don't want to fight. And a lot of people at home don't want to be in the war. And what you have is a significant anti-war movement start up. And I've got a couple of really cool things here. You know, it was a big industry. So here is a poster from a local gathering speaking to the conscience of Atlanta on the war in Vietnam. And you can, I wish I knew what year this was. Unfortunately, they just have the date. But this was a very, very common thing. Lots of folks were getting together. Lots of folks were working together to try to change the course of the war in Vietnam and have the United States get out of the war. And as I said, this eventually built up until the point the elected leaders had to listen and had to start making things happen. You know, and lots of underground presses, they weren't being suppressed, but lots of different people We're publishing a lot of different things. So here's one on Huey Newton, who was arrested for his anti-war sentiments, among other things. But, you know, and there's a lot of different publications that can take place. These are mostly Georgia specific, but these are happening all over the country. And it's sort of the birth of the button, right? So we have a couple of really neat buttons here that were very, very popular. There were all kinds of anti-war buttons. One says, "Tell it to Hanoi," and here's another one with a black and a white hen holding a dove, a symbol of peace. So it's a commentary on racial equality as well as an anti-war sentiment. And again, this is sort of the golden age of buttons, and you see a lot of that sort of thing taking place. And when the soldiers come back home, it's very confusing for them. We can't go into all the details about what it was like for returning veterans, but it's a very jarring experience for anyone who's had to serve in a combat zone to go from that zone and go back to the United States. In World War II, sometimes it would take, most of them were coming back on a troop ship. So there were 2 to 3 months from the time they were fighting in Europe or in the Pacific till the time they got home. These guys, they're on the front lines, literally fighting a war. They get in a Jeep, they go to an airfield, from an airfield to California, they get off that plane sometimes in 24 hours, they're immediately back in the United States, in the world as they call it. There's not a lot of time for transition, there's not a lot of time for readjustment, and that rapidity of coming back and being thrust into the regular United States so quickly starts to have a really, really big effect on those returning veterans. Now, I've talked a lot trying to set all this up, but I want to open it up and do the best that I can to answer any questions that y'all have.
Okay, Helen wants to know, who was the president at the time and how did he feel about this?
Yeah, so the question is, who was president at this time and how did they feel about it? Well, we had a couple of different presidents. Actually 3. John F. Kennedy was president when a lot of the United States advisors, when the United States really began to get involved in South Vietnam, it was John F. Kennedy, because it was very much during the time of we have to stop the communists wherever they're at. So he begins to send the advisory troops and the support troops to Vietnam. Well, he's assassinated, and his vice president, LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, takes over. It's Lyndon Johnson who ends up sending large amounts of American combat troops to South Vietnam. And he does not run for a second term. Instead, a fellow named Richard Nixon becomes president. Now, JFK and LBJ were Democrats. And as very often happens, when there's a lot of unrest at home, there's usually a switch of parties. So Richard Nixon is a Republican, and he gets brought into office on a wave of, let's do something about the Vietnam War. And he's the one who sets up a Vietnamization. In other words, trying to have the war become an issue for South Vietnam, not for the United States. And it's during his presidency that a lot of the American diplomats and the Vietnamese diplomats reach the agreements that eventually withdraws the United States from Vietnam.
All right. Jonathan wants to know, from a military standpoint, was there ever a time we could have achieved victory, like allowing Westmoreland to carry the war into Cambodia and Laos to cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail?
That's a good question. The question is, was there ever a time militarily where we could have actually won? Because there was a big issue with where we were going to fight. Could we swivel the camera to the... What he's talking about is, could we have gone into Cambodia or Laos to attack the North Vietnamese? Because the North Vietnamese soldiers were going into both countries. But because of the way we wanted to fight the war, we did not want to put troops into a country that did not want us. So we sort of have to respect the sovereignty of those different nations. As a result, that means we can only go up into this very, very narrow area. Could we ever have militarily won? Depending upon who you ask and how you look at it, we sort of did militarily win in Southeast Asia. As I said, we were able to defeat the Viet Cong, and suppressed a guerrilla fight, which is not an easy thing to do. We certainly overawed the North Vietnamese army, but the problem becomes in the will at home to carry the war on. And throughout history, wars are won in the will of the people fighting them. If the will especially democracies, that's one of the great and difficult things about democracies. In a democracy, if the people are not wanting to fight the war, if there's not a good amount of will for it, doesn't matter how successful you are militarily, you're not going to be able to achieve that knockout military victory blow that you're trying to get.
Speaking of morale, Tootsie wants to know, tell us how the draft affected morale. Was it a factor in not being successful, or did the attitudes change once they were in combat?
That's a good question. The question is, how did the draft affect the morale of the soldiers? Did it have a negative effect? Did it have an effect once they were in combat? It certainly did have a big effect on morale. When you were drafted, again, and this was only males, when you signed up for selective service, they would draft the males, and when you were drafted, you had to show up or you would go to jail. Or they would come and find you and either put you in jail or force you to join up. So there's not a lot of choice to this. And when you're drafted, you don't necessarily believe in the cause you're fighting for. So you're not going to want to really do your best when you get over there. Now, when you look at men in combat, especially small groups in the size of a squad, say 10 men up to a platoon of about 40 men, what you see is that this is throughout history. This is not just the Vietnam War, but what you see is the fighters become less concerned about what the war is for, and they become concerned with supporting their fellow soldiers that are very, very close to them. It becomes about morale amongst those men, and it's that morale between the men that really drives how effective that the individual fighting forces can be. That's what it becomes about, is taking care of the buddy next to you and knowing that he's going to be taking care of you and that he's got your back. What the war is about and what the causes of it are not that important when you're in a foxhole this deep and you're having to depend upon each other. So that still didn't mean they didn't want to go home. Everyone wants to get away from where people are shooting at you. But the morale overall was not that great in Vietnam. Now, there are I've talked to a lot of different Vietnam vets, and I encourage it for you at home to do that too. A lot of you probably have a dad or a granddad who served in the Vietnam War, and there is no better way to learn about history than to talk to someone who was actually there in the times that you're exploring and trying to learn about. So you're going to get a different point of view from everyone you talk to, and every one of those points of view are equally important. Sorry, I had to do that little sideline there, because nothing's better than primary research, especially if it's someone that's close to you, a family member or a friend.
Can you discuss the role of women in the Vietnam War?
I can. Yeah, the question is, can I discuss the role of women in the Vietnam War? Well, as I said, women were not drafted. They were not part of selective service, but women did serve. Lots of women served as nurses. They had to volunteer. And nurses usually had some sort of advanced education, advanced training to be nurses, and several thousand nurses would go to Vietnam and serve in the hospitals there. Some of them died in action. Some of them were wounded, and some of them they were not pulling triggers per se, but they were still involved in a lot of combat. There is, in Washington, D.C., there's actually a great memorial to the women and the nurses of the Vietnam War. If you want to take a Google at that, or if you've been fortunate enough to go there on the National Mall, it's there next to the Vietnam War Memorial, and it's really neat because those women, as I said, they were all volunteers. They were remarkably brave, and they faced a lot of things that women may not have to face today in terms of how they were perceived, in terms of the roles that they were expected to fulfill. So kudos to all those nurses.
Can you discuss the types of weapons that a soldier might use?
Yeah, let me talk a little bit. The question is, what sort of weapons would a soldier use? I'll sort of focus on the American forces. By and large, during the height of the Vietnam War, they had something called the M16 rifle. And Libby, you may want to pull up an image and just flash it on the screen. But basically, it's a fully automatic. That means when you pull the trigger and hold it down, it's going to keep firing bullets until it's out of ammunition. And those magazines hold about 20 rounds of ammunition. It's a shoulder-fired weapon, so you're holding it like this. And the ammunition is fairly smaller. They had gone to a smaller type of ammunition from World War II so that you could carry more of it. There we go. So you can see that's an M16. You can even see one of the shells coming out of the side, and the magazine going up from the bottom there. And compared to a World War II weapon, which was made of wood and steel, this one did not have any wood in it whatsoever. It was sort of a technological change. It was made of plastic so that it was lighter, so that it wouldn't be damaged as easily. And a lot of soldiers did not like that. They thought Mattel is a company that made toys, and they said, you can tell it's Mattel because it was made of plastic. And the first ones that were sent to Vietnam had a lot of trouble jamming because of the environment. They were able to fix those issues pretty quickly, and it became a reliable weapon. Now, it's something interesting. This is, even though the appearance of it has changed, this weapon, the way it works, the type of ammunition it uses, the type of magazines it uses, is still pretty much the exact same weapon our soldiers use today in 2020. It's like I said, they've changed some of the barrel lengths and some of the way they look, but that main part of the weapon and that main type of ammunition, it's the exact same. So something must have been right with it.
All right. Next, we have, how long did it take to find the Ho Chi Minh Trail? Once this was discovered, what tactics did the U.S. use to begin fighting?
So the Ho Chi Minh Trail, as I said, is a trail through Laos and part of Cambodia that could basically go around any American defenses because it was in another country. We still sent some soldiers across the national border to try to deal with the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We knew about it. We were pretty technologically advanced. We could fly over and look at it with high-quality cameras. We could take pictures. They were even able to drop special kinds of bombs that would be dropped from the plane, go into the ground, and then sense when a large group of men were coming by, they could record the footsteps to let you know that they're there, and it would radio that information back to a base in the United States, or not in the United States, but in the United States controlled area. Very technologically advanced. But because they couldn't go into another country and just start shooting things up, they couldn't necessarily try to break that trail. And remember, I say vehicles, they rarely used motor vehicles for this because they're too loud and too well observed. This was men carrying stuff on their back or on bicycles, bringing all this equipment down to the Viet Cong. It was well worth it for the North Vietnamese, but it was a thorn in the side of the Americans because they could have easily closed it, but they would have had to breach international sovereignty and law to do that.
Can you talk about anti-war celebrities like Jane Fonda during the time?
Yeah, so the question is, can I comment on Jane Fonda and other anti-war celebrities? Jane Fonda is certainly the most famous and somewhat reviled by many because it's one thing to be opposed to the war that your country is fighting because you think it may be wrong, you think it may be too expensive, you think it may be unjust, but Jane Fonda, for many people, tended to go a little bit too far when she actually traveled to North Vietnam and met with North Vietnamese and sort of supported them in their efforts to get independence. So lots of, there were different celebrities, and this is also tied to communism and the fear, not the fear, the concern of communists within the government, of communism within the United States. Remember, this is during the Red Scare, when we were afraid that communists were hiding behind every pillar and post. And whether they were or not, that was a driving force in American politics and American society. And so lots of celebrities who did come out against the war were trying to make it very clear that they were not in favor of communism. They were merely against the war. But the anti-war movement, in Vietnam, it's a little bit different. Right now, there are lots of celebrities that take up lots of different causes, and they get a lot of attention for it. But I think it's important to remember that during the Vietnam War protest, those were much more, as we say, grassroots driven. Those were driven by student bodies. They were driven by racial equality groups and things like that. It was very much a people's movement, and they did not rely so much on celebrity endorsement. It was a much more unified mass movement than it was having celebrities be spokespeople.
Can you talk about chemical weapons and Agent Orange in particular?
Yeah, so there were some chemical weapons used in Vietnam, not necessarily against people, because that was against the Geneva Conventions and things like that. One of the biggest was Agent Orange, and the idea behind it was that if the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army were hiding in the jungle and it was hard to find them, maybe we should just make the jungle go away. So Agent Orange was something that could be sprayed and would basically kill all vegetation where it was sprayed. And so there are pictures you can see before and after of areas where it had gone, where it just kills all the undergrowth and it's just bare ground. Of course, that's an environmental disaster. It gets into the water in lots of things, and there have been a lot of claims, and they seem to be very, very valid, that people who were involved or who would go through areas where Agent Orange had been spread, or those who were whose jobs from the air were to help spread it, caused a lot of disease and sickness and maybe different types of cancer. We did not use any chemical weapons that were specifically against people like World War I, like tear gas and mustard gas and phosgene and things like that. But Agent Orange is the big one that we did try to use to make the battlefield more effective for our forces.
All right, some quick fire questions.
Yeah.
How many people were in the Vietnam War?
Oh, question is how many people were in the Vietnam War? That's a tough one. I think about 1.2 to 1.5 million Americans fought in the war. 58,000 lost their lives. The numbers for the Vietnamese, North and South, dead vary from anywhere from 1 million to over 3 million. So it's hard to pin those numbers down exactly. But a lot of people, well, obviously if you're in Vietnam, if you are Vietnamese, the war is going to affect you in some way. So you could argue that everyone in Vietnam, North or South, was affected by the war or participated in it in some way. For Americans, the numbers are not nearly the entire nation, but several million people were involved directly or indirectly with it. And that 1.2, I can't remember. You really may need to go look that up. But it's a fairly small number of the current population, but you have to remember that almost everyone who did go to Vietnam, a lot of them saw some kind of action somewhere.
Looks like a quick search says 2.7 million Americans served in Vietnam.
Okay, 2.7 million Americans served in Vietnam. Overall, not at one time, but that's the entire course of the war.
Yeah. And when did the Vietnam War end? Can you talk about the conclusion?
Yeah, the Vietnam War ended in 1975 when the North Vietnamese forces conquered South Vietnam and took over its capital of Saigon. The United States officially withdrew all of its soldiers and all of its involvement in 1973.
Do you know what percentage of soldiers were drafted? Or men were drafted?
Yeah, so what percentage of soldiers were drafted? Actually, a little bit less than you would think, because when your number came up to be drafted, you had a choice. You could be drafted, and they would tell you where you were going to go, and you had no say in it. Or if you knew you were about to be drafted, you could actually go volunteer and sign up for the Army, and you might have more of a choice in what you were going to be assigned to, what your job was going to be, things like that. So I want to say only about a third of the American Army was drafted per se, but a lot of them signed up so that they could avoid being drafted and have some choice in how they would serve.
Okay. And was trench warfare common?
Trench warfare was not common at all in Vietnam. However, the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, did use a series of tunnels, and these tunnels became legendary because this is how they would hide, this is how they would be able to get out of sight of the Americans. And when I say tunnels, some of them are only big enough for you to crawl through. Some of them are the size big enough to have a small hospital inside of. So they would have these underground tunnels, these underground bunkers that were very effective, but not necessarily trench warfare.
Melissa wants to know, what is the pipe thing on the uniform?
Oh, the pipe thing on the uniform. This is a flashlight. I don't think I have any batteries in it, but this one has a red lens because a lot of those tunnels, for example, if someone had to go down into a tunnel and find out what was there, all they might have is this flashlight and a pistol. That's going to be their only weapon going into a small tunnel. Absolutely, for me at least, terrifying. But soldiers are going to carry all kinds of equipment like that with them that they may need.
And we have a request to see the paper ration again.
Oh,
I missed it.
Yeah. There we go. The toilet paper ration. It's not a lot. To give you an idea of how much that is and how big it is.
Yeah.
So,
Were there any naval battles?
there were not naval battles per se. One of the things that got the United States involved in the war was the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which is where small Vietnamese craft attacked a U.S. warship. And they didn't do any damage, but it was attacked. Now, again, no naval battles. North Vietnam didn't really have a navy, but the United States Navy was very involved. Submarines and warships tried to do blockades of North Vietnam to keep supplies from coming in. American aircraft carriers would every day have airplanes fly from the carriers to attack North Vietnamese forces. And a lot of folks were involved in other naval ways, especially flying in supplies or even anti-submarines like P-3 Orion aircraft.
Last few questions. Can you talk about graffiti that U.S. soldiers put on their helmets?
Yes. A lot of soldiers, because they were somewhat rebellious because they were draftees, would try to put graffiti on their helmets. This one doesn't have any. Sometimes they did have some. And it really depended upon your unit commander and the officers what they would allow. Some of them just didn't care as long as you did your job and you were a good fighter. Some of them forbade it from being written on it, and they would make you take it off or whatever. So it varied from unit to unit, varied from station to station, and could be as plain as an American flag or a handwritten peace symbol. It could include all sorts of things, but usually officers wouldn't allow very much to go on.
2 more questions. Was there any psychiatric help for troops during the war, after the war?
Was there psychiatric troops for helps during the war? Not a little bit during the war. We call it PTSD now, post-traumatic stress disorder. They did have something like that. They just had a different name for it, and they would try to treat it. But a lot of soldiers, when they came back, didn't get help, couldn't get help, refused to get help for that sort of thing. So it was available, but in a much more limited way than it is now.
Last question. What are some books you'd recommend for further study on the Vietnam War?
What are some books I would recommend for study on the Vietnam War? There are a lot of books out there, but there's one book, I think it's by Gilbert, just called Vietnam War, A History. Martin Gilbert. I should have brought some of the books with me to talk about that. That's a very grown-up book. There are a couple of good books for kids. There's one, I don't know if moms and dads and teachers, if you've ever seen the eyewitness books, those really cool hardcover books that have lots of pictures in them. There is one on the Vietnam War. I have that one, and it's actually a very good one. It shows a lot of different equipment, a lot of different artifacts, a lot of different pictures, but it also sort of gives a good story, a good summated story of the war. All right, folks, thanks for tuning in. I hope I was able to answer some of your questions. I hope I was able to sort of put a little bit of clarity on something that's very complex and very long-term in American history. Please join us tomorrow as we'll be going back thousands of years in time and looking at the armies of Caesar. But until then, I'm Glenn Kyle with the Northeast Georgia History Center. We hope you stay safe, and we hope that if you're able to give us any support whatsoever during these times, that you can do that. Just go to our website and click on that donate button. But until tomorrow, we'll see you.